Richard Bennett, a billionaire accustomed to success, was surrounded by business partners and colleagues, celebrating yet another multi-million-dollar deal at an upscale restaurant in Manhattan, New York. The evening was perfect, or so it seemed. Outside, dressed in tattered clothes and moving with hesitant steps, a man entered. He didn't belong in a place like that. Andrew, with tired eyes and trembling hands, walked into the restaurant, unsure of himself. He was impossible to ignore. The diner's gazes shifted in seconds, from curiosity to discomfort. Some whispered, others pretended he wasn't there, but the sentiment was universal: he didn't belong. Andrew stopped in the middle of the room, turned to the nearest waiter, and in a low, almost inaudible voice, asked for food. "Just a plate, anything you can spare." His presence had already disrupted the evening's harmony, but the silence that followed was even more unnerving. From across the room, Richard observed the scene. His first instinct was to ignore it and return to the toast he had just made. Situations like this were familiar to him: someone walking into a fancy restaurant asking for help. It usually ended in chaos. But there was something different about this man, something unsettling that Richard couldn't quite shake. Meanwhile, the waiter hesitated. He glanced at the manager, who shook his head, then approached Andrew. "I'm sorry, sir. We can't serve anyone without a reservation or upfront payment." Andrew swallowed hard. He didn't beg or argue. He simply lowered his gaze and began to leave. At that moment, as if driven by an inexplicable impulse, Richard raised his hand and called the waiter over. "Let him come here," he said, surprising even himself with the firmness in his tone. Andrew froze, unsure of why this impeccably dressed man, so clearly out of his world, was beckoning him. The entire room held its breath. Richard locked eyes with him and gestured to the empty chair at his table. "Sit down," he said, his gaze unwavering. It was as if something about Andrew drew him in, as though there was a truth within the man that Richard was both afraid and compelled to confront. Andrew approached cautiously, like a man stepping into unknown territory. He sat slowly, avoiding eye contact with Richard or anyone else at the table, who now seemed as uneasy as they were intrigued. The silence between them was broken only by the clink of a wine glass being set down. Richard studied Andrew like a puzzle he wasn't sure he wanted, or knew how, to solve. "Are you hungry?" Richard finally asked. His voice was calm but carried an undertone of curiosity, maybe even something deeper. Andrew looked up for the first time. His eyes held exhaustion, shame, but also a surprising dignity. He took a deep breath, as if choosing the right words was harder than enduring the cold outside. "I am. But it's more than that," he said, his tone cutting through the room. "It's hard to explain, but, have you ever felt like the whole world turned its back on you? Like, there's no way out?" Richard didn't answer right away. The question lingered in the air, resonating more deeply than Andrew likely intended. Leaning back in his chair, Richard interlaced his fingers. He remembered what it was like to feel overlooked by the world, or at least he thought he did. But he chose not to say anything. Somehow, he felt Andrew wasn't there to simply talk but to be heard. Around them, the other diners continued to stare, their murmurs growing louder, accompanied by expressions of disdain. The restaurant manager watched nervously from a distance, clearly hoping this scene would end soon. But Richard didn't care. For the first time in years, he seemed genuinely interested in something, or someone, outside his meticulously controlled life. Andrew broke the silence again. "I wasn't always like this, you know. I had a life, not wealthy, but good. My wife, Jenny, was amazing. We had 2 kids, twins. They were the best part of everything. Until it all fell apart." His voice faltered, but he pressed on, as if releasing a burden he'd carried for years. "I lost my job, the house, and I lost them, too." Richard stayed silent, but his expression hardened. He didn't want to show it, but something about Andrew's words struck him in a way he couldn't explain. Before Andrew could finish, a waiter discreetly placed a plate of food in front of him. Andrew looked at the meal as though it were sacred but didn't eat right away. "Thank you," he whispered, barely audible. "So, what do you want now?" Richard asked, breaking the silence once more. His tone wasn't harsh, just disarmingly sincere. Andrew looked back at him, his expression a blend of hope and resignation. "I just want someone to believe I can still be somebody." The silence between the two was thick, almost tangible. Richard wasn't used to hearing stories like Andrew's. For him, failure was something to be avoided at all costs, a possibility he had never allowed himself to experience. Yet now, sitting across from this man, he felt uncomfortably exposed, as if Andrew had unearthed something he'd buried long ago. "And what about you?" Andrew suddenly asked, catching Richard off guard as he was lost in thought. "Did you ever have someone who believed in you, when no one else did?" The question hit Richard like a punch to the gut. He averted his gaze, staring at the candle in the center of the table. Its flame flickered slightly, as if reacting to the whirlwind of emotions swirling in the room. He thought of his childhood, the small house where he lived with his mother, a woman who worked late into the night yet still found time to encourage him to dream. Richard was the son of a cleaning lady and an absent father. He had never known luxury, but he'd always had someone who believed in him. "My mother," he murmured, almost inaudibly. For the first time that evening, his voice wavered. He quickly straightened in his chair, as though the vulnerability had slipped out unbidden. "She never gave up on me. Even when I was, well, a lost cause." Andrew listened intently. There was no judgment in his expression, only a quiet understanding. "What happened to her?" he asked, as if it were the most natural question in the world. Richard took a deep breath, dreading the memory. "She passed away before she could see all of this," he said, gesturing subtly to the lavish surroundings. "Before I had what I have now. But she laid the foundation for everything." Andrew regarded him with intensity. It wasn't just admiration or respect, it was something deeper. Their conversation seemed to hold up a mirror, reflecting back pieces of Andrew's own lost life. "You were lucky," Andrew said, offering a brief, bitter smile. "Not everyone has that. Sometimes, all you have is emptiness, and no one to fill it." A chill ran through Richard. He wanted to respond, to say something to break the weight of Andrew's words, but nothing came. Across the restaurant, patrons continued whispering, though their murmurs now seemed distant, almost irrelevant. All that existed was their table and the dialogue, a quiet battle between past and present. "Why did you come here tonight?" Richard finally asked, steering the conversation in a new direction. "Why this place, at this time?" Andrew lifted his gaze, his lips forming a faint smile while his eyes glistened. "I don't know," he admitted. "Something brought me here. Maybe because, even when it feels pointless, sometimes you just have to try. Just one last time." Andrew glanced at the plate of food in front of him, but his hunger seemed overshadowed by something more profound. He picked up the fork, hesitated, and set it down. Instead of eating, he looked back at Richard. "I had a family," he began, his voice steadier now, as if bracing himself to unearth painful memories. "I had everything that mattered. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Then, when things started to fall apart, there was no one to catch me." Richard held his gaze as the others at the table pretended not to listen. The world around them seemed to freeze, leaving only their conversation, a dialogue that appeared simple yet carried a weight only those who'd lost everything could understand. Andrew continued, his voice softer now but still charged with emotion. "My wife, Jenny, she tried. For a long time. But it's hard to keep believing when everything starts crumbling. And I lost control." A pause lingered, long enough for the faint clinking of silverware and distant laughter to seep back into the room. Andrew took a deep breath before continuing. I wanted to be the man she deserved. I wanted to give everything to my kids. But in the end, all I gave them was an example of what not to be. I lost my job, her respect, and then they left. He rubbed his hands over his face, as if trying to erase the memory. And I don't blame them for it. Richard felt a lump in his throat but kept his expression composed. He knew Andrew's story could easily be dismissed as just another tale of someone who didn't make it. Yet something about Andrew gnawed at him. Maybe it was because he saw a reflection of himself in this man, a part of him he'd suppressed for so long it now felt like a stranger. And since then? Richard asked, breaking the heavy silence. Andrew gave a small, bitter smile. Since then, I've been surviving. One day at a time. Today was one of those days, where you think maybe all you need is a reason, a spark, to keep going. Funny thing is, when I walked in here, I didn't even know what I was looking for. Richard leaned forward slightly, intrigued. And now? Did you find what you were looking for? Andrew didn't answer immediately. He studied Richard, as if trying to discern what the billionaire truly wanted to hear. I'm not sure yet, he finally said. But you listened to me. And for someone like me, that's already a lot. Richard leaned back, his eyes still fixed on Andrew. Something about their conversation had pulled him into a place he'd avoided visiting for years. He thought of his mother, of how she had believed in him even when he doubted himself. But there was another memory, a more painful one, that Richard had buried deep. Until now. I lost my father when I was very young, he said, almost as an unexpected confession. Not to an accident or illness. He just left. He couldn't handle the pressure of providing for a family. My mother never blamed him, but I couldn't understand. He paused, as though the words had been bottled up for far too long. I grew up angry. And I swore I would never be like him. Andrew listened in silence, his expression saying more than words ever could. He understood the weight of those words, the effort it took for Richard to pull them out. Suddenly, something seemed to click. Leaning forward slightly, Andrew asked, with a steady gaze, do you think you succeeded? In not being like him? The question caught Richard off guard. He opened his mouth to reply but stopped. It was as if all the words he knew had vanished. He had built an empire, amassed wealth most people couldn't even dream of, yet that simple question left him shaken. Before he could respond, Andrew continued. I think that's what hurts the most, you know. When you lose people, it's not just them who leave. They take pieces of you with them. Sometimes, pieces you can never get back. Richard lowered his gaze, staring at the table. Andrew's words pierced something he thought was impenetrable. He understood loss but had never allowed himself to feel it. Not until now. Their conversation was interrupted by a nervous waiter who approached cautiously. Mr. Bennett, he began, hesitating. The manager asked me to let you know that, perhaps it would be best to resolve this elsewhere. He shot a discreet glance at Andrew, making it clear who he was referring to. Richard raised his hand, signaling him to stop. His eyes turned colder, but not out of anger. He turned to Andrew and said, finish your plate. Then we'll talk somewhere no one can interrupt us. Andrew nodded slowly and began eating, saying nothing more. Richard scanned the restaurant, noticing the disapproving and disdainful look still directed at their table. For the first time, he truly saw the people around him for what they were, and it disturbed him deeply. As Andrew ate, Richard pulled out his phone and began typing something. It wasn't a habit he indulged in during meals, but this time it felt necessary. He typed quickly, his expression shifting from introspection to resolve, as though something had finally clicked in his mind. From across the table, Andrew watched discreetly, unsure of what to expect. There was something about Richard that was hard to understand but impossible to ignore. He didn't know where this was heading, but for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of possibility. The night was colder than Richard had remembered when they stepped out of the restaurant. Andrew followed silently. The street was nearly empty, save for a few taxis passing by, their headlights slicing through the icy air as a reminder that the world outside continued to spin, indifferent to the events unfolding between these two men. Richard stopped beside his car but made no move to get in. He looked at Andrew, who stood waiting, hands buried in the pockets of his worn-out coat. It was as though Richard was still trying to decipher what this encounter truly meant to him. "Get in," Richard said, opening the passenger door. Andrew hesitated. He wasn't used to trusting people, especially not someone who had everything he lacked. But after a moment of uncertainty, he climbed into the car. The silence inside was as heavy as the conversation they'd had at the restaurant. Richard turned on the heater but didn't start the engine. He rested his hands on the steering wheel, staring ahead as if trying to organize his thoughts. "I don't know why I asked you here," he began, his voice low, his eyes still avoiding Andrew. "Maybe it's because seeing you tonight reminded me of things I've spent years trying to forget. Or maybe it's because I wanted to do something my mother would have done." Andrew furrowed his brow, confused. He couldn't tell if Richard was being genuine or just trying to ease his own conscience. "And what would that be?" he asked, his tone a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Richard finally turned to face him. "Giving someone a chance when they need it most." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "You said in the restaurant that you just wanted someone to believe you could still be somebody. Maybe I want to believe that, too." Andrew stared at Richard for a long moment. The billionaire's words were simple, yet they carried a weight that Andrew recognized. It wasn't charity or pity. It was something more genuine, and therefore, more terrifying. "And why do you think I deserve that?" Andrew asked, his voice tinged with bitterness, more directed at himself than at Richard. "I don't know if you do," Richard replied bluntly. "But I do know that if no one gives you a chance, you'll never find out." The silence returned, filling the space between them. But this time, it felt different. It wasn't discomfort or tension, it was a quiet understanding. Richard took a deep breath and started the engine. "Let's take a drive," he said as the car began to glide slowly down the street. Andrew didn't ask where they were going. He simply looked out the window, watching the city lights reflect in his eyes like promises he wasn't sure he could trust. The car moved quietly through the empty streets of New York, the engine humming softly as the two men sat in silence. Andrew stared out the window, trying to figure out where Richard was taking him. Each building, each corner bathed in the yellow glow of the city lights, seemed to tell a story Andrew had long ceased to be a part of. Yet, what unsettled him the most wasn't the city or its lights, it was Richard's silence. The billionaire appeared to be wrestling with something, carefully choosing whether to speak or remain quiet. Finally, the car stopped in front of a modest building with a worn facade. A small, well-kept garden at the entrance added a touch of warmth to the otherwise tired exterior. It was not the kind of place Andrew expected someone like Richard to know, let alone visit. Richard turned off the engine and stared straight ahead for a few moments before finally breaking the silence. "This is where my mother could afford to live when I was a kid," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is where it all started. And where it almost ended." Andrew didn't respond. He wasn't sure how to react to such an unexpected revelation. He looked at the building, then back at Richard, trying to piece together what was happening. "Do you want to know why I brought you here?" Richard continued, finally meeting Andrew's gaze. "Because I know what it feels like to hit rock bottom. To lose everything, or almost everything, and believe there's no way out." He paused, taking a deep breath. "My mother used to say that sometimes what you need isn't a miracle, but someone who believes you still have worth." Andrew felt a lump in his throat. The weight of those words hit him like a punch, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned his eyes back to the building, as though trying to see Richard's memories in the darkened windows. "And do you believe that?" Andrew finally asked, breaking the silence. That I still have worth. Richard turned to him, his gaze unwavering and resolute. I do. But it won't mean anything if you don't believe it yourself. The response was blunt, almost harsh, but Andrew sensed something different in it. It wasn't just compassion, it was a challenge. He turned away, staring at his reflection in the car window. It was hard to believe in himself when the world seemed to have discarded him long ago. I'm going to give you a chance, Richard said after a moment. But what you do with it, that's up to you. Andrew blinked, taken aback. He didn't know whether to thank him or refuse. How many times had he heard promises that went unfulfilled? Yet there was something in Richard's voice, something he couldn't ignore. Richard opened his door and stepped out, walking toward the building's gate. He didn't look back to see if Andrew followed. It was a choice Andrew had to make on his own. For a moment, Andrew was frozen. The weight of the decision pressed on his chest like a heavy stone. But before he could overthink it, he opened the door and stepped out into the cold night air. This time, the chill didn't feel as empty as before. As he crossed the sidewalk toward the building, a strange feeling began to stir inside him. It wasn't quite hope, but it was close. Something he thought he'd lost forever. The hallway of the building was narrow, illuminated by a flickering yellow light. Andrew followed Richard, their footsteps echoing against the peeling walls. A faint smell of mildew lingered, mixed with the scent of some cheap cleaner trying to mask the building's decay. Richard stopped in front of a worn wooden door with a crooked number 4 hanging by a single nail. This was it, Richard said softly, turning the handle carefully. The door opened to reveal a small, empty apartment, clean but bare. The white walls were marked where pictures had once hung. The wooden floors creaked underfoot, and a dim street lamp outside cast weak light through the lone window. Andrew stepped inside hesitantly, as though the space didn't belong to him. He glanced around, trying to picture the life Richard had described. The silence between them was heavy but not uncomfortable. It felt as if both men understood that too many words could ruin the significance of the moment. Richard walked to the window, gazing out at the street below. This is where my mother taught me that having little doesn't mean having nothing, he said, turning to face Andrew with a serious expression. She always said that as long as you have the strength to get out of bed, there's still something in you that matters. Andrew didn't respond right away. He just watched Richard, trying to understand how a man who had everything still carried scars so deeply etched. Yet, there was something more he couldn't ignore, the idea that, somehow, this place could be a new beginning. Why do you still remember all of this? Andrew finally asked. With everything you have now, wouldn't it be easier to forget? Richard gave a small, humorless smile. Because forgetting doesn't erase what happened. It just buries it deeper. And sometimes, what you bury is what you need to keep going. He took a step closer, stopping just a few feet from Andrew. I can't change what happened to me. And I can't change what happened to you either. But I can give you what my mother gave me, a chance. Andrew stared at Richard, searching for any trace of dishonesty in his words. But all he found was sincerity, raw and uncomfortable, but real. And what do you expect from me? Andrew asked quietly. I expect you to try, Richard replied. Not for me, but for yourself. I can open the door, but walking through it, that's on you. Andrew looked around the apartment again. Its emptiness and simplicity seemed to ask a question he didn't yet know how to answer. He wasn't sure if he could try again. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like someone believed he could. Andrew sat on the apartment floor, his back against the wall, arms crossed tightly. He seemed small in the empty space, yet there was something subtly different in his posture, a mix of exhaustion and a faint glimmer of hope he wasn't sure he should nurture. Richard remained standing, watching him. Motivational speeches weren't his style, they never had been. But for some reason, he felt compelled to say something, even if it felt out of place. I grew up here, Richard began, gesturing around the room. Back then, I hated this place. I thought it symbolized everything we didn't have. But looking at it now, I realize this is where I learned to survive. Andrew glanced up at him but said nothing. He seemed to absorb every word, as though searching for something in them he could hold on to. You might think you've hit rock bottom, Richard continued. But what I've learned is that sometimes, the bottom is just a place to start. This is where my mother taught me how to turn almost nothing into something. And that's what I'm offering you. Not luxury, not comfort, just a beginning. Andrew ran a hand over his face, as if trying to clear the chaotic thoughts in his mind. I don't know if I can, he admitted, his voice cracking. I've tried so many times, and I've failed every single one. Richard moved closer and sat across from him, his calm demeanor unchanged. Failure isn't the problem. The problem is giving up. And from what I see, you haven't given up yet, or you wouldn't be here. Andrew stayed quiet, his hands trembling slightly but planted firmly on the floor. He knew Richard was right, but accepting it was another story. Accepting it meant confronting everything he had buried, everything he had avoided for so long. Why are you doing this for me? Andrew finally asked, looking directly at Richard. You don't even know me. You don't have a reason to. Richard gave a small smile, one laced with more pain than joy. Because, years ago, someone did this for me. And if I don't pay it forward, then everything I've achieved won't mean a thing. Andrew blinked slowly, as if the words had struck something deep within him. He didn't respond right away, but his expression shifted ever so slightly. A faint spark, hesitant but present, flickered in his eyes. Outside, the sound of a passing car broke the silence. Richard stood and walked to the door. He paused, looking back at Andrew one last time. The keys on the table. The rest is up to you. Without waiting for a response, he left, closing the door softly behind him. The echo of Richard's footsteps descending the stairs faded gradually, leaving Andrew staring at the closed door. He didn't know whether to chase after him or stay put. But for the first time in years, he felt the faintest trace of purpose. Minutes passed like hours as Andrew sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the key left on the small table. His thoughts were a storm of doubt and memories he tried to suppress. Part of him screamed that this was a trap, while another part desperately wanted it to be real. He felt stuck between the desire to believe and the fear of disappointment. With trembling hands, he finally picked up the key. Its cool, metallic weight felt heavier than it should. He held it for a moment, as if it might provide answers, then looked around the apartment. There was something about its raw simplicity that reminded him of his old home, the last place where he'd truly been happy. Taking a deep breath, he stood. His eyes scanned the bare walls, as though trying to see the shadow of another life within them. But all he saw was the reflection of what he'd become. The weight of his existence felt even greater now, as if receiving this chance also meant inheriting the responsibility not to fail again. Outside, the night was quiet. Andrew sat on the building steps, watching the distant glow of car lights as they passed. His thoughts wandered to Jenny and the twins. He thought about how he'd failed them, how he'd failed himself. He hadn't heard from his family in years. Deep down, he'd convinced himself it was better that way. But now, a voice inside whispered that maybe there was still time. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the sidewalk. Looking up, he saw Richard standing a few feet away, holding a bag. "I forgot to leave this," Richard said, walking over and handing the bag to Andrew. Andrew accepted it, surprised. Inside was a simple package of food and an envelope. He looked at Richard, puzzled. "I thought you might need it," Richard explained calmly. "But what's in the envelope is more important." Andrew carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a modest amount of cash, not extravagant, but enough for a few days, and a handwritten note with an address. "What is this?" Andrew asked, looking up. "It's a place where you can get real help," Richard said. They helped me when I was at my lowest. It's not charity, but support for people who want to rebuild. They taught me that sometimes all you need is a starting point. Andrew swallowed hard. He knew Richard was offering more than just assistance, he was offering a bridge to something greater. But accepting it meant admitting he needed help, and that was the hardest part. Why do you keep doing this? Andrew asked, his voice steadier now. I've asked you before, but, really. Why? Richard lowered his head briefly, as if searching for the answer within himself. When he met Andrew's gaze again, his expression was softer. Because, years ago, my mother helped someone who wouldn't have survived without her. And that day, she taught me that helping someone is the only thing that truly matters, even if you never know the outcome. Maybe I'll never know what you'll do with this, but that doesn't change what I can do for you now. Andrew didn't respond immediately. He held the bag and the envelope tightly against his chest. For a moment, his eyes grew damp. It wasn't just gratitude, it was something deeper, a fragile feeling that maybe, just maybe, he could start to believe again. Andrew looked at the paper with the address of the community center and the key to the apartment one last time. He understood that Richard had given him more than a roof over his head, it was a choice. A chance he had to decide was worth taking. The next day, Andrew met Richard again, his voice steady and direct for the first time in years. You talked about giving me a chance. I'm ready, but I want more than a place to stay. I want to work. I want to regain my dignity. Richard studied him for a moment, gauging the sincerity in his words. Work isn't charity, Andrew. It's effort. Are you ready for that? Without hesitation, Andrew replied, I am. Richard placed him at one of his companies, a logistics firm that provided delivery and storage services. The work was straightforward but demanding. Andrew began by carrying boxes and organizing inventory, tasks that pushed his body, unaccustomed to physical labor. The first few days were grueling, and he nearly gave up. But when he received his first paycheck, something changed. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of dignity. Every dollar he earned was a reminder that he was moving forward, one step at a time. During one of their conversations, something unexpected came up. Andrew mentioned Margaret, Richard's mother, without realizing the impact it would have. Richard, your mother. Margaret. I think I met her years ago. Richard frowned, confused. My mother? That doesn't make sense. She never left New York. Andrew took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. She did leave. It was during a hard time for me. I was staying at a shelter, trying to pull myself together, and Margaret helped me find work. She was the first person who believed I still had worth. Richard fell silent, processing what he'd just heard. Later that evening, as he sifted through an old box of letters, he found one Margaret had written but never sent. It described a man she had helped, someone trying to rebuild his life. Without mentioning a name, it perfectly described Andrew. Richard immediately called Andrew. My mother wrote about you. She believed in you before I ever did. Maybe that's why I felt compelled to help you. Andrew was overwhelmed with emotion. The thought that Margaret had touched his life years earlier felt almost impossible but made perfect sense. In the days that followed, Andrew worked harder than ever, earning a promotion to supervisor because of his dedication and commitment. With financial stability, Andrew made the most difficult and important decision of his life, reconnecting with Jenny and the twins. The reunion was filled with tears, silence, and apologies. Jenny was hesitant at first, but Andrew's genuine effort softened her heart. He didn't promise miracles, instead, he showed her he was ready to be part of their lives again. The twins, now teenagers, gradually warmed up to him, curious about who he had been and who he was becoming. Months later, Andrew and Richard organized an event at the community center to help others in difficult situations find work and rebuild their lives. During the event, Andrew stood on stage holding Margaret's letter in his hands. His voice was steady but emotional as he addressed the crowd. Believing is the first step. That's what Margaret Bennett taught me. It's what work gave back to me, dignity. No matter how far you've fallen, there is always a way to rise again. But you have to take the first step, and believe it's worth it. Richard, sitting in the audience, stood and applauded along with everyone else. He knew his mother would have done the same, proud of what they had built together. Andrew had found something greater than himself, a purpose. And that night, he finally felt whole again, a man with dignity and hope. Stay tuned for more inspiring stories. Just click the video on your screen now.